Open the door, Emily. The voice was calm, controlled, the kind of voice that didn't need to be loud to be obeyed, and it sent a strange chill down my spine even before I fully understood why, because men like that didn't just show up in places like this. Not in a narrow hallway that smelled faintly of old paint and cheap detergent. Not outside a one-bedroom apartment where the rent was already 3 weeks late. And yet there he was, standing on the other side of my door like he belonged there, like he had every right to knock on my life and expect an answer, and all I could do was stand frozen with my hand hovering over the handle, my heart beating too fast, my mind racing back to the night before when everything still made sense. When the biggest problem I had was deciding whether I could afford dinner or if I should just go to bed hungry again. Because $20 doesn't stretch very far in New York, not when rent is due, not when your paycheck got cut short, not when life keeps asking for more than you have left to give. And I remember staring down at that last bill in my wallet like it was something sacred, something I wasn't supposed to let go of, something that meant survival for one more day. Maybe two if I was careful. And I told myself I would hold on to it no matter what, that I had to, because no one was coming to save me, no one ever had. But then I saw him, sitting on the curb just outside the corner deli, shoulders slightly hunched, jacket too thin for the cold, his face shadowed under the dim streetlight in a way that made it hard to read. And there was something about him that didn't match the usual people who asked for help, something quiet, something controlled even in the way he looked up when I passed, not desperate, not demanding, just waiting, like he already knew how this moment would end, and I should have kept walking. I know that now. I should have held on to that $20 like it was the only thing keeping me afloat, but my steps slowed. Anyway, my fingers tightening around the edge of my wallet, and I heard myself ask, "Do you need help?" before I could stop myself, and his eyes met mine then, dark, steady, too aware for someone who was supposed to be down on his luck, and for a second, just a second, I felt like I was the one being seen, like he was the one deciding something about me, not the other way around, and it made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't explain, but I ignored it, because that's what I always did. I ignored the warning signs and chose kindness instead, even when it didn't make sense, even when it cost me more than I could afford, and before I could second-guess myself, I pulled that last 20 out of my wallet and held it out to him, my hand trembling slightly from the cold, or maybe from the weight of what I was giving up, and he looked at the bill, then back at me, like he was measuring something deeper than the money, something I couldn't see, something I didn't understand, and when he finally took it, his fingers brushed mine for just a second, warm, steady, and he said, "Thank you," in a tone that felt heavier than it should have, like it carried meaning I wasn't ready for, and I nodded quickly, forcing a small smile before turning away, because staying any longer felt dangerous in a way I couldn't explain, and I walked home that night with empty pockets and a growing knot in my stomach, telling myself I had done the right thing even as hunger settled in and reality hit harder with every step. And now, standing here with that same uneasy feeling crawling up my spine, listening to the quiet authority in the man's voice outside my door, I can't help but wonder if that $20 didn't just change my night, but my entire life. I should not have opened the door. That was my first thought as my fingers finally closed around the handle and turned it slowly, because something about the silence outside felt too heavy, too controlled, like the moment was already decided and I was just stepping into it. And when the door cracked open, the first thing I noticed was not him but them. Two men standing a few feet back in dark tailored suits, perfectly still, their posture straight, their eyes scanning the hallway with quiet precision, the kind of presence that did not belong anywhere near my building. And then I saw him, standing directly in front of me exactly where I had imagined. Only now the dim streetlight from last night was replaced by the harsh overhead bulb of my hallway. And there was no hiding what he was, not anymore. His coat perfectly fitted, his shoes polished, his entire presence composed in a way that made everything around him feel smaller, including me, and my breath caught before I could stop it because I recognized him instantly, not just his face but the feeling, that same unsettling awareness from the night before, the same sense that he saw more than he should. And for a moment neither of us spoke, the air stretching thin between us until he finally broke it with a small tilt of his head, as if confirming something only he understood. And then he said my name again, softer this time, "Emily," and hearing it in his voice felt different. like it carried weight, like it belonged to him in a way that made my chest tighten, and I forced myself to find my voice, even though it came out quieter than I intended. How do you know my name? Because that was the only question that mattered, the only one that made sense in a situation that clearly did not, and his gaze held mine steadily, calm, unhurried, as if time moved differently for him. And then he stepped slightly closer, not enough to invade my space, but enough to make it clear that distance was his choice, not mine, and he answered in a tone that was almost gentle, which somehow made it more intimidating. I make it my business to know things that matter. And the words should have sounded vague, maybe even dismissive, but they did not. They landed with a certainty that made my pulse spike, because I knew, somehow I knew, that he was not exaggerating, and before I could respond, he reached into the inside pocket of his coat, slow, deliberate, every movement controlled, and pulled out something small, something folded, and held it out toward me. And I hesitated, my eyes flicking between his hand and his face, trying to understand what was happening, trying to catch up to a moment that felt like it was moving too fast and too slow at the same time. And when I finally took it, my fingers brushing against his again, that same warmth, that same steady calm, I unfolded it, and my breath stopped completely because it was money, more than I had seen in one place in a long time. Crisp bills stacked neatly, far more than $20, far more than I could justify, and I looked up at him in disbelief, confusion tightening my chest. I cannot take this, I said quickly, instinctively, because nothing about this felt normal, nothing about this felt safe. But his expression did not change, not even slightly, and he shook his head once, a small, decisive motion. You already did, he replied, and the simplicity of it hit harder than anything else he had said, because it made it sound like this was not a gift, not charity, but something inevitable, something that had been set in motion the moment I made my choice. And I felt that same strange shift in the air again, like the ground beneath my life had quietly moved without asking me first. And then he added, his voice lower now, more personal. You gave me everything when you had nothing left. And the way he said it made my throat tighten, because no one had ever said anything like that to me before. No one had ever looked at something so small and seen something so big. And before I could process it, before I could even decide what I was supposed to feel, he took a half step back, giving me space again, but not really, because his presence still filled the doorway, still filled the moment, and his eyes softened just enough to make it worse. Now it is my turn, he said quietly, and I realized then, standing there with too much money in my hands and too many questions in my head, that this was not just about repayment. This was something else entirely, something I did not understand yet, but something that was already changing everything. My fingers tightened around the money, the crisp edges pressing into my skin like they were trying to remind me that this was real, that this was actually happening, but everything inside me resisted it, because nothing about this situation made sense. Not the amount, not the man standing in my doorway, not the way he spoke, like my choices had already bound us together in some invisible way I could not undo. And I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet his gaze again, even though it felt like standing too close to something powerful, something I did not fully understand. I only gave you $20, I said, my voice steadier than I felt, because I needed to anchor this moment to something logical, something small, something normal. But the faintest hint of a smile touched his lips, not amused, not mocking, just knowing, like he had expected that answer. And he shook his head slightly. No, he said quietly, you gave me a choice. And the words made my chest tighten in a way I could not explain, because how could something so simple mean something so much to someone like him? Someone who clearly had more than he could ever need. And yet the way he stood there, the way his eyes held mine, told me that he meant every word. And before I could ask what he meant, he continued, his voice calm, but carrying something deeper underneath. Most people see what they can get. Emily, you saw what someone else needed. And the hallway felt smaller somehow, quieter, like the world outside had faded just enough for his words to settle in. And I found myself glancing down at the money again, then back at him, still unsure, still caught between disbelief and something else I was not ready to name. That does not mean you owe me anything, I said, softer now, because part of me needed that to be true, needed this to be simple, a kind act returned and nothing more. But his expression shifted just slightly, not harder, not colder, just more certain. "It is not about owing," he replied. "It is about recognizing value when I see it." And there was something in the way he said value that made it clear he was not talking about the money in my hands. And that realization made my pulse quicken again, because it meant he was looking at me in a way no one else ever had, like I was something worth noticing, something worth protecting. And the thought felt both comforting and dangerous at the same time. And before I could respond, he glanced briefly down the hallway, a subtle movement, but enough to remind me that he was not alone, that the men behind him were still there, still watching, still part of a world I had no place in. And when his attention returned to me, it felt sharper somehow, more focused. "You live alone," he said, not a question, and my stomach dropped slightly because he was right, because of course he was right, and I nodded before I could stop myself, the motion small, cautious, and he studied me for a second longer before continuing. "That changes today," and the words hit me like a quiet shock, not loud, not forceful, but undeniable, and I felt my grip on the money tighten again, confusion and resistance rising at the same time. "I did not ask for anything to change," I said quickly, because I needed to draw a line, needed to hold on to some sense of control in a situation that was already slipping beyond me. But he did not react the way I expected, did not argue, did not push. Instead, his voice softened just enough to make it worse. "I know," he said, "that is exactly why it will." And there was no threat in his tone, no pressure, just certainty, the kind that came from someone who was used to making decisions and watching the world adjust around them. And I felt that shift again, that quiet, unsettling realization that this moment was not just a coincidence, not just a repayment, but the beginning of something larger, something I had stepped into the second I handed over that $20. And as he took another small step back, giving me space, again while still holding my attention completely, he added, almost gently, "You do not have to understand it yet." And then, after a brief pause that felt intentional, "You just have to trust that I do." And I stood there in my doorway, heart racing, mind spinning, holding more money than I had seen in months while looking at a man who felt like he could change everything with a single decision. And for the first time in a long time, I was not sure if that terrified me, or if part of me wanted to believe him. The silence stretched between us after his words settled, thick and unfamiliar, and I realized I was still standing there barefoot on the cold floor, my hand gripping the edge of the door like it was the only thing keeping me steady, because everything else felt like it was shifting too fast, and I forced myself to take a small breath, trying to gather whatever control I had left. "I do not trust people I just met," I said, the words coming out more honest than defensive, because that was the truth. That was the rule I had lived by for years, the one thing that had kept me safe in a city that did not care if you fell behind. And for a second I expected him to challenge that, to push back the way someone like him probably always did, but instead he nodded once, slow and deliberate, like he respected the answer, like he had already accounted for it. "You should not," he replied quietly, and the agreement caught me off guard more than anything else he had said so far, because it meant he was not trying to convince me, not forcing anything, and somehow that made it harder to resist him, not easier, and I felt my grip on the money loosen slightly as my thoughts tried to catch up with the moment. "Then why are you here?" I asked, because that question had been sitting at the center of everything from the second I opened the door, and his gaze did not waver as he answered. "Because someone like you should not be left unprotected." And the word unprotected landed differently than I expected, not like a threat, not like a warning, but like a statement of fact, like something obvious that I had somehow missed, and I shook my head slightly, a small, instinctive reaction. "I have been fine on my own," I said, even though the words felt thinner than I wanted them to, because fine was relative. Fine meant surviving, not living, and something in his expression told me he understood that distinction without me having to explain it. "Surviving is not the same as being safe," he said calmly, and the way he said it made my chest tighten again, because it was too close to the truth, too close to something I did not like admitting even to myself. And before I could respond, he reached into his coat again, slower this time, and pulled out a small card, simple, dark, with nothing but a number printed on it. No name, no company, just a number, and he held it out to me the same way he had the money, steady, certain, and I hesitated again before taking it, my fingers brushing against the smooth surface as I looked down at it, then back up at him. "What is this?" I asked quietly, and his answer came just as calm, just as certain. "A way to reach me." And something about that made my pulse quicken again, because it sounded simple, but it was not. Not when it came from someone like him, not when. Everything about him suggested that access was not something he gave lightly, and I swallowed, trying to keep my voice steady. And why would I need that? Because I needed to hear him say it. Needed to understand what he thought this connection between us actually meant. And for the first time his gaze softened just enough to feel different, less distant, more focused. "Because life has a way of changing when you least expect it," he said, his voice lower now, more personal. "And when it does, you will not have to face it alone." And the words settled into me in a way I was not prepared for, because they touched something deeper than logic, something quieter, something I had not realized was still there. And I looked down at the card again, then at the money still in my other hand. And for a moment I felt suspended between two versions of my life, the one I knew, the one I could predict, even if it was hard, and the one standing right in front of me, unfamiliar, uncertain, but impossible to ignore. And when I looked back up at him, he was already stepping away, the movement smooth, controlled, like he knew exactly when to leave before the moment lost its weight. And he paused just once at the edge of the hallway, his voice carrying back to me one last time, quiet but undeniable. "Keep the door locked tonight, Emily." And there was no fear in his tone, no urgency, just certainty. The kind that made it sound less like advice and more like something that was already decided. And then he turned and walked away, the men behind him falling into step without a word, leaving me standing there in the doorway with too many questions. And something new settling in my chest, something that felt a little like unease and a little like something else I could not quite name yet. I stood there long after the hallway had gone quiet, long after the echo of his footsteps disappeared, my hand still resting against the door as if I had forgotten how to move. And it was not until a draft of cold air brushed against my bare feet that I finally blinked and stepped back, slowly closing the door until the lock clicked into place, the sound sharper than usual, final in a way that made my chest tighten. And for a moment I just leaned against it, staring down at what I was holding. The money in one hand, the card in the other, both of them feeling heavier than they should, like they carried more than their weight, like they carried a decision I had not consciously made yet. And I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding before pushing myself away from the door and walking further into my apartment, the familiar space suddenly feeling different, smaller somehow, like it had not caught up with whatever had just happened. And I set the money down carefully on the small kitchen table, smoothing it out instinctively, counting it once, then again, my heart racing a little faster with each number because it was real, undeniably real, enough to cover rent, groceries, maybe even a little more, enough to give me breathing room I had not had in months. And that realization should have brought relief. It should have made everything easier, but instead it made everything more complicated. Because nothing in my life had ever come without a cost, and I could not shake the feeling that this would not be the exception, and my eyes drifted to the card still in my hand. Simple, minimal, just a number printed cleanly across the surface. No name, no explanation, just a direct line to someone who clearly did not live in the same world I did. And I turned it over slowly between my fingers, as if something else might appear if I looked at it long enough, some hidden meaning. Some clue that would make this all make sense, but there was nothing, just the quiet weight of possibility, and I moved to the small window by my bed, pulling the curtain back just enough to glance outside, my breath catching slightly when I saw them still there, the black cars parked along the curb, engines silent, their presence unmistakable even from this distance, and I watched as one of the men stepped out briefly, speaking into something near his ear before glancing up toward my building. His posture alert, controlled, like he was waiting, not for instructions, but for confirmation, and I let the curtain fall back into place. Quickly, my pulse quickening again because whatever this was, it had not ended when he walked away. It was still here, just quieter now, just out of sight, and I turned back into the room, running a hand through my hair as I tried to think, really think about what I was supposed to do next, because pretending this had not happened was not an option. Ignoring it was not an option. And yet stepping into it felt just as uncertain, just as dangerous in a different way. and I found myself looking down at the card again, my thumb tracing over the number slowly, and I remembered the way he had said it. Not a demand, not even a suggestion, just certainty, like he already knew this moment would come, and I hesitated for a long second before placing the card down beside the money. Putting distance between me and both of them like that might help me think more clearly, but it did not, because the truth was already there, settling quietly in the back of my mind. Impossible to ignore that. Something had shifted, something I could not take back, and as I moved to turn off the light, the room falling into a softer darkness, I realized that for the first time in a long time, the silence did not feel empty. It felt watched, not in a threatening way, not in a way that made me panic, but in a way that made me aware that I was no longer completely alone, and that thought lingered as I lay down, staring up at the ceiling, the weight of the day pressing against me, until one question finally surfaced above the rest, quiet but persistent, not what had just happened, but what would happen next. I did not sleep much that night, not really, because every time I closed my eyes I saw his face again, calm, certain, like he had already decided something about me that I had not agreed to yet. And the strange part was not fear, not exactly. It was the way my thoughts kept circling back to his words, the way they lingered long after everything else had gone quiet. And by the time the first pale light of morning slipped through the thin curtains, I was already awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant hum of the city, starting another day as if nothing had changed, even though everything had, at least for me. And I pushed myself up slowly, the cold floor grounding me as I walked toward the small kitchen table where the money and the card still sat exactly where I had left them, untouched, almost like proof that none of it had been a dream. And I stood there for a long second before reaching for the bills again, counting them once more out of habit, out of disbelief, out of something I could not quite name. Because the reality was simple, this could fix things, at least for now. It could buy me time, stability, a break from the constant pressure of barely getting by. And yet my gaze kept drifting back to the card beside it, because that was the part that did not come with a clear explanation. That was the part that felt like a door I was not sure I should open, and I picked it up again, turning it slowly between my fingers, feeling that same quiet tension settle in my chest. Because calling him meant stepping into whatever this was, acknowledging that this connection existed, and I had spent years avoiding anything that complicated my life more than it already was. And yet here I was, holding a number that felt impossible to ignore, and before I could think too much about it, my phone buzzed softly against the table, the sudden sound making me flinch slightly as I glanced down to see a message from my landlord, short, direct, reminding me about the overdue rent. The words simple but heavy in their implication, and I exhaled slowly, closing my eyes for just a second because this was my reality. This was what I knew: pressure, deadlines, consequences, and when I opened them again my gaze moved back to the money, then to the card, and I realized something that made my chest tighten in a different way. This was not just about him. This was about choice, my choice, the same kind of choice I had made the night before, when I gave away something I needed because it felt right. And now I was standing in front of another one, just as uncertain, just as defining. And I let out a quiet breath before setting the money aside and picking up my phone instead, my thumb hovering over the screen as I looked down at the number, printed on the card, memorized now without even trying. And for a moment I hesitated, the silence stretching again, that familiar pull between caution and curiosity, between staying in control and stepping into the unknown. And then I pressed the numbers one by one, slow, deliberate, my heartbeat picking up with each digit until the call connected, the ringing soft but steady in my ear. And it did not last long, not even 2 full seconds before the line clicked, and his voice came through, clear, composed, like he had been expecting this exact moment. "Emily," he said, and the way he said my name this time felt different again, more certain, more personal. And I swallowed, my grip tightening slightly around the phone as I tried to steady my voice. "You said I could call." I managed, because it was the only thing that felt safe to say, the only thing that kept this grounded in something normal. And there was a brief pause on the other end, not hesitation, not surprise, just a measured silence before he responded, "I knew you would." And something about that made my pulse quicken, not because it sounded arrogant, but because it sounded true. And I found myself standing there in the quiet of my apartment, holding on to a conversation that felt like the beginning of something I could no longer pretend I was not part of. There was something about the way he said it that made silence settle heavier between us. Not awkward, not uncertain, just inevitable. Like this conversation had been waiting to happen long before I finally pressed call, and I found myself gripping the edge of the table with my free hand, grounding myself in something real as I tried to steady my thoughts. You sound very sure about that, I said quietly, because I needed to push back, needed to remind both of us that I still had control over my choices. But on the other end of the line, his response came without hesitation, calm and measured. I am, and there was no arrogance in it. No pressure, just a simple certainty that made it harder to argue against. And I exhaled slowly, glancing down at the money still spread across the table, then back at the card, even though I already knew the number by heart now. This is a lot, I added, my voice softer, more honest, because that was the part one could not ignore, the reality of what he had given me, what it meant for my situation, for my life. And there was a brief pause before he replied, not long enough to feel like hesitation, just enough to feel deliberate. It is what you needed, he said, and the way he phrased it made my chest tighten again. Because he was not guessing. He was stating it like a fact, like he already understood parts of my life I had never shared. And I pushed myself upright, pacing slowly across the small space of my apartment as I tried to process that. You do not even know me, I said, a little more firmly this time, because that mattered, that boundary mattered, but his voice remained steady, unchanged. I know enough, he replied, and the words lingered for a second before he continued, softer now, more precise. I know where you live. I know you work 2 jobs. I know you skipped dinner last night so you could make it through the week. And I stopped walking, my breath catching slightly because each detail landed too close, too accurate. And I felt that familiar tension rise again, not fear exactly, but awareness, the realization that he had been paying attention in a way no one else ever had. And I swallowed, my voice quieter when I spoke again. Why? Because that was the only question that mattered now. Not how, not when, but why he would care enough to notice any of that. And this time the silence on the other end lasted a fraction longer. Not uncertainty, but intention, like he was choosing his words carefully. And when he spoke again, his voice carried something different. Something more personal beneath the control. Because you are not like the others, he said, and I closed my eyes briefly. The words settling deeper than I expected, because I had heard things like that before, in different forms, from different people, but never like this, never with this kind of weight behind it. And I let out a quiet breath, leaning back against the wall as I tried to keep my thoughts from drifting too far. And what does that mean? I asked, because I needed clarity, needed something concrete to hold on to in a conversation that kept slipping into something else, something harder to define, and his answer came softer this time, almost reflective. It means you chose kindness when it cost you something, he said, and that is rare. And there was something in the way he said rare that made it feel like more than an observation, like a decision, like something he had already placed value on. And I felt my grip on the phone tighten slightly as I realized what this really was, not just a repayment, not just a coincidence, but attention, focused and intentional. And before I could respond, he added quietly, I do not ignore things like that. And the words settled between us with a quiet finality that made my pulse quicken again. Because it meant this was not temporary. This was not something that would fade once the moment passed. This was something he had chosen to pursue. And I stood there in the quiet of my apartment, listening to the steady sound of his breathing on the other end of the line, realizing that whatever this was, whatever I had stepped into, it was no longer just about one decision, one night, or one act of kindness. It was becoming something else entirely, something that was already beginning to change the way I saw everything around me. And for the first time since I made that call, I understood that this conversation was not just an answer. It was an invitation. The word invitation lingered in my mind even after the silence returned, stretching between us in a way that felt heavier now, more defined. And I realized I had not responded yet, that I was still standing there with the phone pressed to my ear, my thoughts moving slower than the moment demanded. Because something about this was shifting again, something subtle but undeniable. And I forced myself to speak before the silence turned into something else, something I could not take back. You talk like you already decided something for me, I said, my voice quieter but steadier now, because I needed to hold on to that line, needed to remind him that whatever this was, it was not one-sided. And for a brief second there was no response, just the faint sound of his breathing on the other end, controlled, measured, before he finally answered. I decided to offer, he corrected calmly. What you do with it is still yours, and the distinction mattered more than I expected, because it gave me space, even if it still felt like he was standing right at the edge of it, waiting, and I exhaled slowly, glancing around my apartment as if seeing it differently now. The worn furniture, the small space, the life I had built piece by piece, and I realized how much of it had been about holding on, about making do, about surviving without expecting anything more, and his voice broke through that thought gently but firmly. Tell me something, Emily, he said, and there was a shift in his tone, something more direct, more intentional. When was the last time someone gave you a choice that actually changed something? And the question caught me off guard, not because it was complicated, but because it was simple in a way that forced an answer, and I opened my mouth before closing it again, searching for something honest, something real, but nothing came, because the truth was uncomfortable. The truth was that most of my choices had been about limiting damage, not creating change, and I let out a quiet breath, my voice softer when I finally spoke. That depends on what you mean by change. And there was the faintest pause before he replied, like he had expected that answer too. I mean the kind that makes things better, not just manageable. And the words settled deeper than I wanted them to, because they touched something I had stopped thinking about a long time ago, something I had learned not to expect, and I leaned back against the wall again, my grip on the phone loosening slightly as my thoughts shifted. That is not how life usually works, I said, almost to myself, because it felt safer to believe that, safer to keep expectations small. But his response came immediately, quiet but certain. That is because you have been surrounded by people who benefit from you staying where you are. And something about that made my chest tighten, not in fear, but in recognition, because there was truth there, truth I had not wanted to name. And before I could respond, he continued, his voice softer now, but no less steady. I am offering something different, and the simplicity of it made it feel more real, not exaggerated, not dramatic, just different. And I closed my eyes briefly, letting the words settle, feeling that pull again between caution and something else, something that felt dangerously close to hope. And when I opened them again, my gaze landed on the money still on the table, then on the card, and I realized that this was not just about what he was offering. It was about what I was willing to accept, and I swallowed, my voice quieter now, more honest than before. And what exactly does that mean? Because I needed to hear it clearly, needed to understand what stepping into this would actually look like. And this time when he answered, there was no pause at all, no hesitation, just certainty. It means you do not have to struggle alone anymore, he said. It means when something stands in your way, it gets handled. And there was something in the way he said handled that made it clear he was not speaking casually, not making empty promises, but stating something he fully intended to follow through on. And my pulse quickened again, because I could hear the weight behind it, the power behind it, even if I did not fully understand the extent of it yet. And I stood there in the quiet of my apartment, realizing that this was the moment, the one where everything could shift depending on what I chose to say next. And for the first time since this all began, I understood that this was not just an invitation to something easier. It was an invitation to something entirely different. The silence after his words did not feel empty anymore. It felt like a line drawn in front of me, clear and impossible to ignore, and I realized my heart was beating faster than it should, not because I was afraid, but because I understood what he was really offering, not just help, not just money, but a shift, a way out of the constant pressure I had learned to live with. And I tightened my grip on the phone slightly, my thoughts racing through every possible outcome, every warning I had ever given myself about accepting things that seemed too good, too easy, because nothing in my life had ever worked that way. And yet his voice had not sounded like a promise. It had sounded like certainty. And that was what made it harder to dismiss. And I took a slow breath, glancing once more at the table, at the money that could already change things, even without anything else. And I realized something then that made everything feel sharper, more defined. This was not about whether I needed help. It was about whether I was willing to accept it from him, from someone who clearly operated in a world I did not understand, and I spoke before I could lose the moment, my voice quieter but steady. Nothing comes without a price, because that was the truth I had learned the hard way, the rule that had kept me careful. And there was a brief pause on the other end before he responded, not defensive, not dismissive, just calm. You are right, he said, and the agreement caught me off guard again, because I had expected him to deny it, to soften it. But instead he continued, his tone just as steady. The price is that you stop pretending you have to do everything alone. And the words settled into me in a way I had not expected, because they did not feel like a transaction. They felt like a challenge, like something I had been holding on to for too long. And I swallowed, my chest tightening slightly as I leaned back against the wall, letting that sink in, because it was not about giving something up. It was about letting something go, something I had built my entire life around. And I closed my eyes for a second, the weight of that realization pressing down on me, before I opened them again and spoke, softer this time, more honest than before. And if I say no, because I needed to know that too, needed to know where the line really was. And his answer came without hesitation, just as calm as everything else he had said. Then nothing changes, he replied. You keep the money, you go back to your life, and I walk away. And there was something in the simplicity of that made my chest tighten again, because it meant the choice was real. It meant he was not forcing anything, not trapping me. And somehow that made the decision heavier, not lighter. And I stood there in the quiet of my apartment, realizing that this was exactly what he had said, a choice that could actually change something, not just make it manageable. And I let out a slow breath, my gaze drifting once more to the small details around me, the life I had built out of necessity, the routines I had followed without question. And for the first time I saw them clearly for what they were, not stability, not safety, but limitation. And when I brought the phone back closer to my ear, my voice was steadier than I expected, carrying something new underneath it, something I had not felt in a long time. Then I guess I need to understand what changes, I said. And there was a faint shift on the other end of the line, almost imperceptible, but enough to tell me that this mattered, that my words had crossed some kind of threshold. And when he spoke again, his voice was just as calm, just as certain. But there was something else there now, something quieter, more personal. It starts with this, he said. You let me make your life easier. And I felt my breath catch slightly at the simplicity of it, because it did not sound complicated, it did not sound overwhelming. But I knew it was more than that. I knew it was the beginning of something that would ripple far beyond this moment. And as I stood there, holding on to a decision that felt both small and enormous at the same time, I realized that the night I gave away my last $20, I thought I was losing something, something I needed, something I could not afford to give. But standing here now, I understood the truth I had missed in that moment. I had not lost anything at all. I had opened a door, and whether I stepped through it or not, it was already there, waiting.